Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Kanoa Reviews. Today we take a look at the game The Sinking City, a game that, believe it or not, was at my number 1 spot for most anticipated games of 2019. I am a huge fan of detective games as long as they are in 3D and in real time, but unfortunately this genre is not popular at all with the main Kanoa audience and was partially why I wanted to start a review channel like this. You see, where I first did Let's Play series, and a series of multiple episodes on a detective game could be quite bad for the channel, with the review, it's just one episode, and if people don't care that much, they will just wait until the next review of a totally different game and genre. It still gives me the opportunity to play and make content about a genre of gaming I love. There were multiple reasons why I was so excited for The Sinking City, of which the first was the earlier mentioned fandom of detective games. But the other cool thing was that it would be set in a world inspired by Lovecraft lore and particularly Cthulhu. I absolutely adore Lovecraft type stories and have played many games set in that setting, including both Call of Cthulhu, the old one back in the day of the original Xbox, and the one that came out last year. The third reason why I was excited was because Frogware would be responsible for this game. Frogware is responsible for some of the better Sherlock Holmes games in recent years, including some classics that I love like Sherlock Holmes vs. Jack the Ripper and The Testament of Sherlock Holmes. Both games present an interesting story with genuinely good puzzles, environments, and overall a great experience, though maybe a bit limited since the studio is rather small. Most of their games have felt like B-game titles, and I did hear that their last Sherlock Holmes game, which I did not play, got a lot of critique due to overuse of action scenes, something that the detective fans were not too happy with. I also hope that we could finally get a game that would do Lovecraft and Cthulhu justice, since both Call of Cthulhu games were very disappointing. The first Call of Cthulhu had an incredibly strong beginning, and despite its ugly graphics by today's standard, still has one of the most incredible first 2 to 3 hours of any adventure or detective game. Unfortunately, once the action gets introduced, it loses any sense of a detective-style adventure and becomes boring, monotonous, frustrating, and just uninteresting. The Call of Cthulhu game of last year was actually my most disappointing game of that year, since I hoped it would be good with the technological improvements that happened over the years. But that game too had a strong opening, with the first hour probably being the best, and then it just turned to a boring stealth game with horrible buggy stealth mechanics, frustrating sections where you needed to hide from monsters that could insta-kill you, and there too the detective feeling went out of the window in that short time span. So with that, I started The Sinking City with high hopes and expectations, though of course I did realize that this too would probably feel quite like a B game, since the studio is still not as big as some AAA ones are. And indeed, the game feels very much so as a B game, but the good thing nowadays is that the graphics engines have developed so much that even a budget type game like this can look beautiful and very atmospheric due to good use of the Unreal 4 engine. You begin the game as your character, Private Eye Charles Reed, arrives at the city of Oakmont, a place that was haunted by a large flood that made many places and districts unlivable. You as a character were attracted to this place due to disturbing visions you were having, and you received a correspondence that there were people here who could help you with that. This game too has a very strong opening, though I would still say that the first Call of Cthulhu has the best out of all these three. As you explore the docks and port of Oakmont, a great sense of detail can be noticed, as the area is littered with objects, props, and creepy imagery like half-eaten sharks, large squids, and octopuses. Moments later, you stumble on some interesting characters, as seemingly a murder has been committed, and your detective work can begin. The strong point of this first hour is that it is all very cropped in a dense area. The game suffers later on from a lot of backtracking and traveling, which is not all that interesting. But here, everything takes place at the dock and it all has a really good flow to it. You are given multiple points of interest to investigate, and there are well-written notes and lore to collect, photos to look into, people to interview, etc. A first-person mode, like the previous Sherlock Holmes games, would have been appreciated, but does not lessen the experience. Soon after, you get introduced to a new gameplay mechanic, and one that is very similar, both mechanic-wise and in terms of visuals, to one that was used in the 2018 Call of Cthulhu. After having collected enough evidence, you go into a state where the world turns blue and you have several occurrences at a crime scene. Your job then is to choose these occurrences in the right order. Though I don't find these sections all too interesting visually, I can say that all these points felt logical and I literally had all these sections correct on the first try through the entire game, sometimes indeed being forced to think about how the situation unfolded, really making me feel like a detective. That was very cool indeed, though again, I think the presentation could have been a bit better than just white ghost-like figures in a blue world. Mere moments later, another mechanic gets introduced where if you press on a button, you get to see the world through a certain supernatural vision where illusions, secret signs, and even hidden doorways show up. I wasn't a fan of this simply because I prefer an old school detective kind of approach where finding clues and answers is a more practical manner rather than depend on some weird demon vision. Another mechanic that we get introduced with is something similar to what was done in a few of the previous Sherlock Holmes games. As you collect evidence and intel, certain statements get written down and collected in your so-called mind palace. As you receive more of these, it becomes clear that some are connected in a cause and effect manner. This can help you to deduce or clear up certain situations and even can help you with making certain choices, because yes, that is in this game too. Within the first hour of the game, you are presented with your first choice that alters the game and story a little bit. It's your typical standard choice of letting a guy go or reporting him to the authorities. If you let him go, you get a bit of a higher reward and receive a note later on from the guy himself. It's a nice touch, and you will get a lot more of these choices through the game, of which some of course have more drastic repercussions than others. It is nice to have this, since many of the characters are not necessarily bad or good. I left one choice in particular, where you have to choose between keeping a ruthless crime boss on the throne or killing him and letting his gentle son take over. Though his son is very nice to the people, he in some way has connections to a dangerous cult, and therefore it might be best to leave the ruthless and violent crime boss in its place. These moral choices are greatly appreciated, and it was also nice to see that the game did not shy away from grotesque imagery or heavy subjects like racism and xenophobia. But the game unfortunately never really gets scary, and at most made me feel a bit uncomfortable. After the first strong hour, the game continues to be strong in terms of its story for a while as the game opens up. With you having access now to the entire city, you head over to different districts to talk and do tasks for various people. You can travel there by boat, which is interesting first but gets a bit boring later, or fast travel once the areas have been visited at least once. What is really cool here is how you need to find your destination manually. On your map there are no markers, and often you get an address that you have to look for yourself. It will often say a street name or place it's near, and then you need to go there yourself by figuring out where it is on the map. I love this since again, it made me feel like a detective, where I had to figure out stuff on my own. Though I did find it very tedious for side quests, as you often get 2 or 3 locations you need to find on the map at once. I also was disappointed with the questing system being basically that. You get to a person to receive some info, but you only get this once you perform a task for them. They give you the address for the task, and then you go there and need to return to them to get the reward. At one particular point, I needed something from a guy, and before he would give me what I wanted, I had to help him with getting out of the city, an objective that had absolutely nothing to do with the investigation at hand. So he gave me an address of a bar, and I had to travel all the way across the city to talk to a barkeeper, and the moment I talked to the barkeep, he also refused to help me until I performed a task for him, and he gives me another address I have to go to. This is just not very interesting gameplay-wise and quite boring. To mention another positive note though, there are several locations like the library, the police station, the city hall, and the hospital, where you can find clues by searching through the archives. In order to do this, you need to choose the right criteria, and this really makes you feel like a detective once more, since you need to analyze notes or evidence you have collected and base the criteria on that. Very cool and very well done. I also can say that the main story has a nice flow and interesting characters to meet and speak to, with the exception of that section I mentioned earlier with getting someone out of the city. Ironically, during that section you still meet very interesting characters like the crime boss, but it just does not have anything to do with the main story, since you are trying to help someone get out of town, and therefore it would have been better to introduce these characters along the way of actually investigating the visions or finding answers for yourself. There's nothing wrong with performing a task for someone before they give you the information, but in this section it basically becomes you doing a task for someone who you need to talk to as a task for someone who you need to talk to as a task for someone else. And up until now, I've been very positive about the game, and in all honesty, I really like this game and would argue that it is the best Cthulhu game compared to the earlier two, so props for that. But unfortunately, it is definitely not without its share of problems. As I said, this game feels definitely like a B game. Though the game looks very nice, especially the world with lots of detail and beautiful lighting, the same cannot be said for the characters. Though the model textures are actually really impressive, with scars, etc. being very visible on their skin, their lack of facial expressions become very apparent that the team lacked budget for this. The same amount of character models get also reused again and again, and especially black people have the same face model over and over again. As you walk through the city, it is actually quite crowded, making the place feel quite alive. But here too, it can be noticed how clunky and B the game really feels. The animations are incredibly stiff, and the NPCs often jitter all over the place and sometimes simply spawn out of thin air right in front of you. I will say that for a team with such a limited scale and budget, I was surprised to find out how many different animations there were for the NPCs. I saw NPCs keeping themselves warm at the fire, getting someone else to shine their shoes, reading a newspaper on the bench, breaking into a fight, buying a newspaper from another, enjoying a coffee at a cafe, or playing the harmonica. Despite the game feeling glitchy and buggy, you can see that the creators had the intention and heart to make a believable and unique world. Unfortunately, the result leaves some to be desired. Then finally we come to the two biggest flaws of the game, and the first is combat. All Cthulhu games have combat in them, since you often get face to face with creatures from the deep. Within the first hour, you have your first encounter with one of these creatures, and it immediately becomes apparent that combat feels very clunky. The weapons don't feel good to use, and weapon impact is terrible. If you shoot a person in the shoulder or stomach, their bodies do not react at all, and the same goes for the monsters. Basically, after you've hit them enough times, they fall to the ground like a sack of potatoes. Your targeting reticule is often very big, making aiming a chore. The enemies do a good job though of sidestepping or skittering all over, making it difficult to fight these, which was the intention of the creators. But unfortunately, mechanically, it is also frustrating to fight these monsters, and that of course could not have been their intention. At least it did not go the route of you having to hide until the monster comes by, as I am sick and tired of that gameplay mechanic. Ammo is very scarce, and you can craft and collect more via a system that resembles The Last of Us a bit, where you go through cabinets and boxes to get compartments. After a single fight, you often will have used a lot of your ammo, and you need to think carefully if you want to engage in another fight. I will say that the main quest does a good job in terms of flow of introducing new, bigger, and stronger monsters to you. However, what completely ruins this, and my biggest complaint about the game, are its side quests. Throughout the city, you will meet figures who require some things from you, like investigate certain buildings, find logs in different areas, or taking photos of multiple crime scenes. These quests have you running throughout the entire city and almost always have the same formula. Go somewhere, deal with the enemies, search for a book or log, and then go to another assigned location. It's very monotonous, and also becomes apparent that indoor layout gets copied quite a lot, making the areas you visit a lot less interesting. What also frustrated me is that there's no indication of how difficult a side quest is, and you can easily spoil future enemy encounters, as you will face huge monsters during some of these before you've even seen them during the main quest. It would have been better if the side quest would have been unlocked once you reach a certain point in the story. It's also a shame that some of these have not been implemented within the main story itself, because even though the formula is quite boring, some of the lore or notes that you find are quite well written. One of these side quests actually had me enter a house of students who appeared normal, but soon after had some hidden skeletons in their closet. Or head towards a restaurant where a cannibal was secretly serving his guests human meat. Very creepy and eerie stuff that were great encounters, but were made bland because they were not implemented within the main story, and therefore felt like missed opportunities. In the end, I did enjoy myself quite a bit with The Sinking City. Is it the game of the year since I anticipated it so much? No. Alas, not because of the buggy and budget feel of the game. I can definitely recommend this to lovers of adventure games or detective games though. In that case, this is definitely a must play, with again the note that the game you are about to play has a very much a B game feeling to it. If you're more of a fan of action games or gameplay games, I would suggest staying far away from this, since those sections leave something to be desired. I personally want to be immersed into a story or a world that takes me on an awesome and mysterious journey, and that is exactly what this did. In the end, The Sinking City gets a 7.9. I would have loved to give it an 8, but I just can't, with the world feeling so buggy, the combat feeling very weak and clunky, and the side quests that are absolute chores that take away from the main story and experience. I think Frogware is on a good streak with this and hope to see more Cthulhu or Lovecraft-inspired games in the future. If that is the case though, I think I want to feel even more like an adventurer or detective, with a game like this using some mechanics from previous Sherlock Holmes games, like the brilliant and intuitive environmental puzzles that were unfortunately lacking in The Sinking City. Since my expectations were not so high, despite the game being on my top of most anticipated titles, I can't say that I'm disappointed with this game. I of course wish that some of the elements had been done better, but in the end, I can look back with a smile on this awesome detective adventure.